Hi there. If you'd like to support this channel, then please click the like button and maybe even consider the subscribe button so we can find each other again and I can read you more bedtime stories. Welcome back to bedtime. It's been a long day, so let's read some Aldous Huxley together to calm down and escape into the wondrous mind of this fantastic author. Let's start tonight with Eupompus Gave Splendour to Art by Numbers by Aldous Huxley. It was published in 1920 in Limbo and is 3,303 words long. "I have made a discovery," said Emberlin as I entered his room. "What about?" I asked. "A discovery," he replied. "About discoveries." He radiated an unconcealed satisfaction. The conversation had evidently gone exactly as he had intended it to go. He had made his phrase and, repeating it lovingly, "A discovery about discoveries." He smiled benignly at me, enjoying my look of mystification, an expression which I confess I had purposely exaggerated in order to give him pleasure. For Emberlin, in many ways so childish, took an especial delight in puzzling and nonplussing his acquaintances, and these small triumphs, these little scores of people, afforded him some of his keenest pleasures. I always indulged his weakness when I could, for it was worthwhile being on Emberlin's good books. To be allowed to listen to his postprandial conversation was a privilege indeed. Not only was he a consummately good talker, but he had also the power of stimulating others to talk well. He was like some subtle wine, intoxicating just to the Meredithian level of tipsiness. In his company, you would find yourself lifted to the sphere of nimble and mercurial conceptions. You would suddenly realize that some miracle had occurred, that you were no longer living in a dull world of jumbled things, but somewhere above the hodgepodge in a glassily perfect universe of ideas, where all was informed, consistent, symmetrical. And it was Emberlin who, godlike, had the power of creating this new and real world. He built it out of words, this crystal Eden, where no belly-going snake, devourer of quotidian dirt, might ever enter and disturb its harmonies. Since I first knew Emberlin, I have come to have a greatly enhanced respect for magic and all the formulae of its liturgy. If by words Emberlin can create a new world for me, can make my spirit slough off completely the domination of the old, why should not he or I or anyone, having found the suitable phrases, exert by means of them an influence more vulgarly miraculous upon the world of mere things? Indeed, when I compare Emberlin and the common or garden black magician of commerce, it seems to me that Emberlin is the greater thaumaturge. But let that pass. I am straying from my purpose, which was to give some description of the man who so confidently whispered to me that he had made a discovery about discoveries. In the best sense of the word, then, Emberlin was academic. For us who knew him, his rooms were an oasis of aloofness, planted secretly in the heart of the desert of London. He exhaled an atmosphere that combined the fantastic speculativeness of the undergraduate with the more mellowed oddity of incredibly wise and antique dons. He was immensely erudite, but in a wholly unencyclopedic way, a mine of irrelevant information, as his enemies said of him. He wrote a certain amount, but, like Mallarmé, avoided publication, deeming it akin to the offense of exhibitionism. Once, however, in the folly of youth, some dozen years ago, he had published a volume of verses. He spent a good deal of time now in assiduously collecting copies of his book and burning them. There can be but very few left in the world now. My friend, Cope, had the fortune to pick one up the other day, a little blue book, which he showed me very secretly. I am at a loss to understand why Embelin wishes to stamp out all trace of it. There is nothing to be ashamed of in the book. Some of the verses indeed are, in their young, ecstatic fashion, good, but they are certainly conceived in a style that is unlike that of his present poems. Perhaps it is that which makes him so implacable against them. What he writes now for very private manuscript circulation is curious stuff. I confess I prefer the earlier work. I do not like the stony, hard-edged quality of this sort of thing, the only one I can remember of his later productions. It is a sonnet on a porcelain figure of a woman dug up at Knossos. Her eyes of bright, unwinking glaze, all imperturbable, do not even make pretenses to regard the jutting absence of her stays, where many a Syrian gallipot excites desire with spilth of nard. The bistred rims above the fard of cheeks as red as bergamot attest that no shamefaced delays will clog fulfillment nor retard full payment of the Cyprian's praise down to the last remorseful jot. Hail, priestess of we know not what strange cult of Mycenaean days. Regrettably, I cannot remember any of Embelin's French poems. His peculiar muse expresses herself better, I think, in that language than in her native tongue. Such is Embelin. Such, I should rather say, was he. For, as I propose to show, he is not now the man that he was when he whispered so confidently to me as I entered the room that he had made a discovery about discoveries. I waited patiently till he had finished his little game of mystification, and when the moment seemed ripe, I asked him to explain himself. Embelin was ready to open out. Well, he began, these are the facts. A tedious introduction, I fear, but necessary. Years ago, when I was first reading Ben Jonson's Discoveries, that queer jotting of his, Eupompus gave splendor to art by numbers, tickled my curiosity. You yourself must have been struck by the phrase. Everybody must have noticed it. And everybody must have noticed, too, that no commentator has a word to say on the subject. That is the way of commentators. The obvious points fulsomely explained and discussed, the hard passages about which one might want to know something passed over in the silence of sheer ignorance. Eupompus gave splendor to art by numbers. The absurd phrase stuck in my head. At one time it positively haunted me. I used to chant it in my bath, set to music as an anthem. It went like this, so far as I remember. And he burst into song. Eupompus, Eupompus gave splendor, and so on, through all the repetitions, the dragged-out rises and falls of a parodied anthem. I sing you this, he said when he had finished, just to show you what a hold that dreadful sentence took upon my mind for 8 years, off and on, Its senselessness has besieged me. I have looked up Eupompus in all the obvious books of reference, of course. He is there, all right. Alexandrian artist eternized by some wretched little author in some even wretcheder little anecdote, which at the moment I entirely forget. It had nothing, at any rate, to do with the embellishment of art by numbers. Long ago I gave up the search as hopeless. Eupompus remained for me a shadowy figure of mystery, author of some nameless outrage, bestower of some forgotten benefit upon the art that he practiced. His history seemed wrapped in an impenetrable darkness. And then, yesterday, I discovered all about him, and his art, and his numbers. A chance discovery, than which few things have given me a greater pleasure. I happened upon it, as I say, yesterday, when I was glancing through a volume of Zulerius. Not, of course, the Zulerius one knows, he added quickly. Otherwise, one would have had the heart out of Eupompus's secret years ago. Of course, I repeated, not the familiar Zulerius. Exactly, said Emberlin, taking seriously my flippancy. Not the familiar John Zulerius Jr., but the elder Henricus Zulerius, a much less, though perhaps undeservedly so, renowned figure than his son. But this is not the time to discuss their respective merits. At any rate, I discovered in a volume of critical dialogues by the elder Zulerius the reference to which, without doubt, Johnson was referring in his note. It was, of course, a mere jotting never meant to be printed, but which Johnson's literary executors pitched into the book with all the rest of the available posthumous materials. Eupompus gave Splendour to art by numbers. Zulerius gives a very circumstantial account of the process. He must, I suppose, have found the sources for it in some writer now lost to us. Emberlin paused a moment to muse. The loss of the work of any ancient writer gave him the keenest sorrow. I rather believe he had written a version of the unrecovered books of Petronius. Someday, I hope I shall be permitted to see what conception Emberlin has of the Satyricon as a whole. He would, I am sure, do Petronius justice. Almost too much, perhaps. What was the story of Eupompus, I asked. I am all curiosity to know. Emberlin heaved a sigh and went on. Zulerius's narrative, he said, is very bald, but on the whole lucid, and I think it gives one the main points of the story. I will give it to you in my own words. That is preferable to reading his Dutch Latin. Eupompus, then, was one of the most fashionable portrait painters of Alexandria. His clientele was large, his business immensely profitable. For a half-length in oils, the great courtesans would pay him a month's earnings. He would paint likenesses of the merchant princes in exchange for the costliest of their outlandish treasures. Coal-black potentates would come 1,000 miles out of Ethiopia to have a miniature limned on some specially choice panel of ivory, and for payment there would be camel loads of gold and spices. Fame, riches, and honor came to him while he was yet young. An unparalleled career seemed to lie before him, and then, quite suddenly, he gave it all up, refused to paint another portrait. The doors of his studio were closed. It was in vain that clients, however rich, however distinguished, demanded admission. The slaves had their order. Eupompus would see no one but his own intimates. Emberlin made a pause in his narrative. What was Eupompus doing? I asked. He was, of course, said Emberlin, occupied in giving splendor to art by numbers. And this, as far as I can gather from Zulerius, is how it all happened. He just suddenly fell in love with numbers, head over ears, amorous of pure counting. Number seemed to him to be the sole reality, the only thing about which the mind of man could be certain. To count was the one thing worth doing, because it was the one thing you could be sure of doing right. Thus, art, that it may have any value at all, must ally itself with reality, must, that is, possess a numerical foundation. He carried the idea into practice by painting the first picture in his new style. It was a gigantic canvas covering several hundred square feet. I have no doubt that Eupompus could have told you the exact area to an inch, and upon it was represented an illimitable ocean, covered as far as the eye could reach in every direction with a multitude of black swans. There were 33,000 of these black swans, each, even though it might be but a speck on the horizon, distinctly limbed. In the middle of the ocean was an island, upon which stood a more or less human figure having 3 eyes, 3 arms and legs, 3 breasts, and 3 navels. In the leaden sky, 3 suns were dimly expiring. There was nothing more in the picture. Zulerius describes it exactly. Eupompus spent 9 months of hard work in painting it. The privileged few who were allowed to see it pronounced it finished, a masterpiece. They gathered round Eupompus in a little school, calling themselves the Philorhythmics. They would sit for hours in front of his great work, contemplating the swans and counting them according to the Philorhythmics. To count and to contemplate were the same thing. Eupompus's next picture, representing an orchard of identical trees set in quincunxes, was regarded with less favor by the connoisseurs. His studies of crowds were, however, more highly esteemed. In these were portrayed masses of people arranged in groups that exactly imitated the number and position of the stars, making up various of the more famous constellations. And then there was his famous picture of the amphitheater, which created a furor among the Philorhythmics. Zulerius again gives us a detailed description. Tier upon tier of seats are seen, all occupied by strange cyclopean figures. Each tier accommodates more people than the tier below, and the number rises in a complicated but regular progression. All the figures seated in the amphitheater possess but a single eye, enormous and luminous, planted in the middle of the forehead. And all these thousands of single eyes are fixed in a terrible and menacing scrutiny upon a dwarf-like creature, cowering pitiably in the arena. He alone of the multitude possesses 2 eyes. I would give anything to see that picture, Emberlin added after a pause. The coloring, Zulerius gives no hint, but I feel somehow certain that the dominant tone must have been a fierce brick red, a red granite amphitheater filled with a red-robed assembly, sharply defined against an implacable blue sky. Their eyes would be green, I suggested. Emberlyn closed his eyes to visualize the scene, and then nodded a slow and rather dubious assent. Up to this point, Emberlyn resumed at length, Zulerius's account is very clear, but his descriptions of the later philorhythmic art become extremely obscure. I doubt whether he understood in the least what it was all about. I will give you such meaning as I managed to extract from his chaos. Eupompus seems to have grown tired of painting merely numbers of objects. He wanted now to represent number itself. And then he conceived the plan of rendering visible the fundamental ideas of life through the medium of those purely numerical terms into which, according to him, they must ultimately resolve themselves. Zulerius speaks vaguely of a picture of Eros, which seems to have consisted of a series of interlacing planes. Eupompus's fancy seems next to have been taken by various of the Socratic dialogues upon the nature of general ideas, and he made a series of illustrations for them in the same arithmo-geometric style. Finally, there is Zulerius's wild description of the last picture that Eupompus ever painted. I can make very little of it. The subject of the work, at least, is clearly stated. It was a representation of pure number, or God and the universe, or whatever you like to call that pleasingly inane conception of totality. It was a picture of the cosmos seen, I take it, through a rather Neoplatonic camera obscura, very clear and in small. Zulerius suggests a design of planes radiating out from a single point of light. I dare say something of the kind came in, but actually I have no doubt the work was a very adequate rendering in visible form of the conception of the one and the many, with all the intermediate stages of enlightenment between matter and the Fons Deitatis. However, it's no use speculating what the picture may have been going to look like. Poor old Eupompus went mad before he had completely finished it, and after he had dispatched 2 of the admiring philorhythmics with a hammer, he flung himself out of the window and broke his neck. That was the end of him, and that was how he gave Splendour, regrettably transient to art by numbers. Emberlyn stopped. We brooded over our pipes in silence. Poor old Eupompus. That was 4 months ago, and today, Emberlyn is a confirmed and apparently irreclaimable philorhythmic, a quiet, wholehearted Eupompian. It was always Emberlyn's way to take up the ideas that he finds in books and to put them into practice. He was once, for example, a working alchemist and attained to considerable proficiency in the great art. He studied mnemonics under Bruno and Raymond Lully and constructed for himself a model of the latter's syllogizing machine in hopes of gaining that universal knowledge which the enlightened doctor guaranteed to its user. This time, it is Eupompianism, and the thing has taken hold of him. I have held up to him all the hideous warnings that I can find in history, but it is no use. There is the pitiable spectacle of Dr. Johnson under the tyranny of an Eupompian ritual counting the posts and the paving stones of Fleet Street. He himself knew best how nearly a madman he was. And then I count as Eupompians all gamblers, all calculating boys, all interpreters of the prophecies of Daniel and the Apocalypse. Then, too, the Elberfeld horses, most complete of all Eupompians. And here was Embelin joining himself to this sect, degrading himself to the level of counting beasts and irrational children and men, and more or less insane. Dr. Johnson was at least born with a strain of the Eupompian aberration in him. Embelin is busily and consciously acquiring it. My expostulations, the expostulations of all his friends, are as yet unavailing. It is in vain that I tell Embelin that counting is the easiest thing in the world to do, that when I am utterly exhausted, my brain, for lack of ability to perform any other work, just counts and reckons like a machine, like an Elberfeld horse. It all falls on deaf ears. Embelin merely smiles and shows me some new numerical joke that he has discovered. Embelin can never enter a tiled bathroom now without counting how many courses of tiles there are from floor to ceiling. He regards it as an interesting fact that there are 26 rows of tiles in his bathroom and 32 in mine, while all the public lavatories in Holborn have the same number. He knows now how many paces it is from any one point in London to any other. I have given up going for walks with him. I'm always made so distressingly conscious by his preoccupied look that he is counting his steps. His evenings, too, have become profoundly melancholy. The conversation, however well it may begin, always comes round to the same nauseating subject. We can never escape numbers. Eupompus haunts us. It is not as if we were mathematicians and could discuss problems of any interest or value. No, none of us are mathematicians, least of all Embelin. Embelin likes talking about such points as the numerical significance of the Trinity, the immense importance of its being 3 in 1, not forgetting the even greater importance of its being 1 in 3. He likes giving us statistics about the speed of light or the rate of growth in fingernails. He loves to speculate on the nature of odd and even numbers, and he seems to be unconscious how much he has changed for the worse. He is happy in an exclusively absorbing interest. It is as though some mental leprosy had fallen upon his intelligence. In another year or so, I tell Embelin he may almost be able to compete with the calculating horses on their own ground. He will have lost all traces of his reason, but he will be able to extract cube roots in his head. It occurs to me that the reason why Eupompus killed himself was not that he was mad. On the contrary, it was because he was temporarily sane. He had been mad for years, and then suddenly the idiot's self-complacency was lit up by a flash of sanity. By its momentary light, he saw into what gulfs of imbecility he had plunged. He saw and understood, and the full horror, the lamentable absurdity of the situation made him desperate. He vindicated Eupompus against Eupompianism, humanity against the Philorhythmics. It gives me the greatest pleasure to think that he disposed of 2 of that hideous crew before he died himself. Let us now move on to the second Aldous Huxley story for tonight. And that story is called Cynthia. It was published in 1920 in Limbo and is 2,394 words long. Let's begin. When some 50 years hence my grandchildren ask me what I did when I was at Oxford in the remote days towards the beginning of our monstrous century, I shall look back across the widening gulf of time and tell them with perfect good faith that I never worked less than 8 hours a day, that I took a keen interest in social service, and that coffee was the strongest stimulant in which I indulged. And they will very justly say, but I hope I shall be out of hearing, that is why I propose to write my memoirs as soon as possible, before I have had time to forget, so that, having the truth before me, I shall never in time to come be able consciously or unconsciously to tell lies about myself. At present, I have no time to write a complete account of that decisive period in my history. I must content myself, therefore, with describing a single incident of my undergraduate days. I have selected this one because it is curious and at the same time wholly characteristic of Oxford life before the war. My friend Lycombe was an exhibitioner at Swellfoot College. He combined blood. He was immensely proud of his Anglo-Saxon descent and the derivation of his name from Old English lycam, a corpse, with brains. His tastes were eccentric, his habits deplorable, the range of his information immense. As he is now dead, I will say no more about his character. To proceed with my anecdote, I had gone one evening, as was my custom, to visit him in his rooms at Swellfoot. It was just after 9 when I mounted the stairs, and great Tom was still tolling. In tome Lord, resono bim bam sine fraud, as the charmingly imbecile motto used to run, and tonight he was living up to it by bim-bamming away in a persistent basso profondo that made an astonishing background of discord to the sound of frantic guitar playing which emanated from Lycombe's room. From the fury of his twanging, I could tell that something more than usually cataclysmic had happened, for mercifully it was only in moments of the greatest stress that Lycombe touched his guitar. I entered the room with my hands over my ears. "For God's sake," I implored. Through the open window, Tom was shouting a deep E flat with a spread chord of under and overtones, while the guitar gibbered shrilly and hysterically in D natural. Lycombe laughed, banged down his guitar onto the sofa with such violence that it gave forth a trembling groan from all its strings, and ran forward to meet me. He slapped me on the shoulder with painful heartiness. His whole face radiated joy and excitement. I can sympathize with people's pains, but not with their pleasures. There is something curiously boring about somebody else's happiness. "You are perspiring," I said coldly. Lycombe mopped himself, but went grinning. "Well, what is it this time?" I asked. "Are you engaged to be married again?" Lycombe burst forth with the triumphant pleasure of one who has at last found an opportunity of disburdening himself of an oppressive secret. "Far better than that," he cried. I groaned. Some more than usually unpleasant amour, I suppose. I knew that he had been in London the day before, a pressing engagement, with the dentist having furnished an excuse to stay the night. "Don't be gross," said Lycombe with a nervous laugh. which showed that my suspicions had been only too well founded. "Well, let's hear about the delectable Flossie or Effie or whatever her name was," I said, with resignation. "I tell you, she was a goddess. The goddess of reason, I suppose. A goddess," Lycum continued. "The most wonderful creature I've ever seen. And the extraordinary thing is," he added confidentially and with ill-suppressed pride, "that it seems I myself am a god of sorts." "Of gardens, but do come down to facts." "I'll tell you the whole story. It was like this. Last night I was in town, and went to see that Capital play that's running at the Prince Consort's. It's one of those ingenious combinations of melodrama and problem play which thrill you to the marrow and at the same time give you a virtuous feeling that you've been to see something serious. Well, I rolled in rather late, having secured an admirable place in the front row of the dress circle. I trampled in over the populace and casually observed that there was a girl sitting next to me, whom I apologized to for treading on her toes. I thought no more about her during the first act. In the interval, when the lights were on again, I turned round to look at things in general and discovered that there was a goddess sitting next to me. One only had to look at her to see she was a goddess. She was quite incredibly beautiful, rather pale and virginal and slim, and at the same time, very stately. I can't describe her. She was simply perfect. There's nothing more to be said. "Perfect," I repeated. "But so were all the rest." "Fool!" Lycum answered impatiently. "All the rest were just damned women. This was a goddess, I tell you. Don't interrupt me anymore." As I was looking with astonishment at her profile, she turned her head and looked squarely at me. I've never seen anything so lovely. I almost swooned away. Our eyes met. "What an awful novelist's expression," I expostulated. "I can't help it. There's no other word. Our eyes did meet, and we both fell simultaneously in love." "Speak for yourself." "I could see it in her eyes." "Well, to go on, we looked at one another several times during that first interval, and then the second act began. In the course of the act, entirely accidentally, I knocked my program onto the floor, and reaching down to get it, I touched her hand. Well, there was obviously nothing else to do but to take hold of it. And what did she do? Nothing. We sat like that the whole of the rest of the act, rapturously happy and quietly perspiring palm to palm. I know exactly, so we can pass over that. Proceed." "Of course you don't know in the least. You've never held a goddess's hand." When the lights went up again, I reluctantly dropped her hand, not liking the thought of the profane crowd seeing us, and for want of anything better to say, I asked her if she actually was a goddess. She said it was a curious question, as she had been wondering what god I was. So we said, "How incredible," and I said I was sure she was a goddess, and she said she was certain I was a god, and I bought some chocolates, and the third act began. Now, it being a melodrama, there was, of course, in the third act, a murder and burglary scene in which all the lights were turned out. In this thrilling moment of total blackness, I suddenly felt her kiss me on the cheek. I thought you said she was virginal. So she was, absolutely, frozenly virginal. But she was made of a sort of burning ice, if you understand me. She was virginally passionate, just the combination you'd expect to find in a goddess. I admit I was startled when she kissed me, but with infinite presence of mind, I kissed her back. On the mouth. Then the murder was finished, and the lights went on again. Nothing much more happened till the end of the show, when I helped her on with her coat and we went out together as if it were the most obvious thing in the world and got into a taxi. I told the man to drive somewhere where we could get supper, and he drove there. Not without embracements, by the way. No, not without certain embracements. Always passionately virginal. Always virginally passionate. Proceed. Well, we had supper, a positively Olympian affair, nectar and ambrosia and stolen hand pressures. She became more and more wonderful every moment. My God, you should have seen her eyes. The whole soul seemed to burn in their depths like fire under the sea. For narrative, I interrupted him. The epic or heroic style is altogether more suitable than the lyrical. Well, as I say, we had supper, and after that my memory becomes a sort of burning mist. Let us make haste to draw the inevitable veil. What was her name? Lycum confessed that he didn't know. As she was a goddess, it didn't really seem to matter what her earthly name was. How did he expect to find her again? He hadn't thought of that, but knew she'd turn up somehow. I told him he was a fool and asked which particular goddess he thought she was and which particular god he himself. We discussed that, he said. We first thought Ares and Aphrodite, but she wasn't my idea of Aphrodite, and I don't know that I'm very much like Ares. He looked pensively in the old Venetian mirror which hung over the fireplace. It was a complacent look, for Lycum was rather vain about his personal appearance, which was indeed repulsive at first sight, but had, when you looked again, a certain strange and fascinating, ugly beauty. Bearded, he would have made a passable Socrates. But Ares? No, certainly he wasn't Ares. Perhaps you're Hephaestus, I suggested, but the idea was received coldly. Was he sure that she was a goddess? Mightn't she just have been a nymph of sorts? Europa, for instance. Lycum repudiated the implied suggestion that he was a bull, nor would he bear of himself as a swan or a shower of gold. It was possible, however, he thought, that he was Apollo and she Daphne, reincarnated from her vegetable state. And though I laughed heartily at the idea of his being Phoebus Apollo, Lycum stuck to the theory with increasing obstinacy. The more he thought of it, the more it seemed to him probable that his nymph, with her burning cold virginal passion, was Daphne, while to doubt that he himself was Apollo seemed hardly to occur to him. It was about a fortnight later, in June, towards the end of the term, that we discovered Lycum's Olympian identity. We had gone, Lycum and I, for an after-dinner walk. We set out through the pale tranquility of twilight and, following the towpath up the river as far as Godstow, halted at the inn for a glass of port and a talk with the glorious old female Falstaff in black silk who kept it. We were royally entertained with gossip and old wine, and after Lycum had sung a comic song which had reduced the old lady to a quivering jelly of historical laughter, we set out once more, intending to go yet a little farther up the river before we turned back. Darkness had fallen by this time. The stars were lighted in the sky. It was the sort of summer night to which Marlowe compared Helen of Troy. Over the meadows, invisible peewits wheeled and uttered their melancholy cry. The far-off thunder of the weir bore a continuous, even burden to all the other small noises of the night. Lycum and I walked on in silence. We had covered perhaps a quarter of a mile when all at once my companion stopped and began looking fixedly westward towards Witham Hill. I paused, too, and saw that he was staring at the thin crescent of the moon, which was preparing to set in the dark woods that crowned the eminence. "What are you looking at?" I asked, but Lycum paid no attention, only muttered something to himself. Then suddenly he cried out, "It's she!" and started off at full gallop across the fields in the direction of the hill. Conceiving that he had suddenly gone mad, I followed. We crashed through the first hedge 20 yards apart. Then came the backwater. Lycum leapt, flopped in 3/4 of the way across, and scrambled oozily ashore. I made a better jump and landed among the mud and rushes of the farther bank. 2 more hedges and a ploughed field, a hedge, a road, a gate, another field, and then we were in Witham Wood itself. It was pitch black under the trees, and Lycum had perforce to slacken his pace a little. I followed him by the noise he made crashing through the undergrowth and cursing when he hurt himself. That wood was a nightmare, but we got through it somehow and into the open glade at the top of the hill. Through the trees on the farther side of the clearing shone the moon, seeming incredibly close at hand. Then, suddenly, along the very path of the moonlight, the figure of a woman came walking through the trees into the open. Lycum rushed towards her and flung himself at her feet and embraced her knees. She stooped down and smoothed his ruffled hair. I turned and walked away. It is not for a mere mortal to look on at the embracements of the gods. As I walked back, I wondered who on earth, or rather who in heaven, Lycum could be. For here was chaste Cynthia giving herself to him in the most unequivocal fashion. Could he be Endymion? No. The idea was too preposterous to be entertained for a moment. But I could think of no other loved by the virgin moon. Yet surely I seemed dimly to recollect that there had been some favored god. For the life of me, I could not remember who. All the way back along the river path, I searched my mind for his name, and always it eluded me. But on my return, I looked up the matter in Lempriere, and almost died of laughing when I discovered the truth. I thought of Lycum's Venetian mirror and his complacent side glances at his own image, and his belief that he was Apollo, and I laughed and laughed. And when, considerably after midnight, Lycum got back to college, I met him in the porch and took him quietly by the sleeve, and in his ear I whispered, "Goat foot," and then I roared with laughter once again. And now, let's move on to the third Aldous Huxley story in tonight's collection of 4. Another short one, published in 1920 in Limbo. The Bookshop. It seemed indeed an unlikely place to find a bookshop. All the other commercial enterprises of the street aimed at purveying the barest necessities to the busy squalor of the quarter. In this, the main arterial street, there was a specious glitter and life produced by the swift passage of the traffic. It was almost airy, almost gay, but all around, great tracts of slum pullulated dankly. The inhabitants did their shopping in the grand street. They passed, holding gobbets of meat that showed glutinous even through the wrappings of paper. They cheapened linoleum at upholstery doors. Women, black bonneted and black shawled, went shuffling to their marketing with dilapidated bags of straw plat. How should these, I wondered, buy books? And yet, there it was, a tiny shop, and the windows were fitted with shelves, and there were the brown backs of books. To the right, a large emporium overflowed into the street with its fabulously cheap furniture. To the left, the curtained, discreet windows of an eating house announced in chipped white letters the merits of sixpenny dinners. Between, so narrow as scarcely to prevent the junction of food and furniture, was the little shop. A door and 4 feet of dark window. That was the full extent of frontage. One saw here that literature was a luxury. It took its proportionable room here in this place of necessity. Still, the comfort was that it survived. Definitely survived. The owner of the shop was standing in the doorway, a little man, grizzle-bearded and with eyes very active round the corners of the spectacles that bridged his long, sharp nose. "Trade is good?" I inquired. "Better in my grandfather's day," he told me, shaking his head sadly. "We grow progressively more Philistine," I suggested. "It is our cheap press. The ephemeral overwhelms the permanent, the classical." "This journalism," I agreed, "or call it rather this piddling quotidianism, is the curse of our age. Fit only for..." He gesticulated clutchingly with his hands as though seeking the word. "For the fire." The old man was triumphantly emphatic with his. "No, for the sewer." I laughed sympathetically at his passion. "We are delightfully at one in our views," I told him. "May I look about me a little among your treasures?" Within the shop was a brown twilight, redolent with old leather and the smell of that fine, subtle dust that clings to the pages of forgotten books as though preservative of their secrets, like the dry sand of Asian deserts beneath which, still incredibly intact, lie the treasures and the rubbish of 1,000 years ago. I opened the first volume that came to my hand. It was a book of fashion plates, tinted elaborately by hand in magenta and purple, maroon and sulfurino and puce, and those melting shades of green that a yet earlier generation had called the sorrows of Werther. Beauties in crinolines swam with the amplitude of pavilion ships across the pages. Their feet were represented as thin and flat and black, like tea leaves shyly protruding from under their petticoats. Their faces were egg-shaped, sleeked round with hair of glossy black and expressive of an immaculate purity. I thought of our modern fashion figures with their heels and their arch of instep, their flattened faces and smile of pouting invitation. It was difficult not to be a deteriorationist. I am easily moved by symbols. There is something of a Quarles in my nature. Lacking the philosophic mind, I prefer to see my abstractions concretely imaged. And it occurred to me that if I wanted an emblem to picture the sacredness of marriage and the influence of the home, I could not do better than choose 2 little black feet like tea leaves peeping out decorously from under the hem of wide, disguising petticoats, while heels and thoroughbred insteps should figure, the reverse. The current of my thoughts was turned aside by the old man's voice. "I expect you are musical," he said. "Oh yes, I was a little," and he held out to me a bulky folio. "Did you ever hear this?" he asked. Robert the Devil. No, I never had. I did not doubt that it was a gap in my musical education. The old man took the book and drew up a chair from the dim penetralia of the shop. It was then that I noticed a surprising fact. What I had at a careless glance taken to be a common counter, I perceived now to be a piano of a square, unfamiliar shape. The old man sat down before it. "You must forgive any defects in its tone," he said, turning to me. "An early Broadwood, Georgian, and has seen a deal of service in 100 years. He opened the lid, and the yellow keys grinned at me in the darkness like the teeth of an ancient horse. The old man rustled the pages till he found a desired place. "The ballet music," he said. "It's fine. Listen to this." His bony, rather tremulous hands began suddenly to move with an astonishing nimbleness, and there rose up, faint and tinkling against the roar of the traffic, a gay, pirouetting music. The instrument rattled considerably, and the volume of sound was thin as the trickle of a drought-shrunken stream, but still, it kept tune, and the melody was there, filmy, aerial. "And now for the drinking song," cried the old man, warming excitedly to his work. He played a series of chords that mounted, modulating upwards towards a breaking point, so supremely operatic, as positively to be a parody of that moment of tautening suspense when the singers are bracing themselves for a burst of passion. And then it came, the drinking chorus. One pictured to oneself cloaked men, wildly jovial over the emptiness of cardboard flagons. "Versiam a tazza piena il generoso umor." The old man's voice was cracked and shrill, but his enthusiasm made up for any defects in execution. I had never seen anyone so wholeheartedly a reveler. He turned over a few more pages. "Ah, the Valse Infernale," he said. "That's good." There was a little melancholy prelude, and then the tune. Not so infernal, perhaps, as one might have been led to expect, but still pleasant enough. I looked over his shoulder at the words and sang to his accompaniment. "Demoni fatali, fantasmi d'oro, de regni infernali, plaudite al Signor." A great steam-driven brewer's lorry roared past with its annihilating thunder and utterly blotted out the last line. The old man's hands still moved over the yellow keys. My mouth opened and shut, but there was no sound of words or music. It was as though the fatal demons, the phantasms of horror, had made a sudden eruption into this peaceful, abstracted place. I looked out through the narrow door. The traffic ceaselessly passed. Men and women hurried along with set faces. Phantasms of horror, all of them. Infernal realms wherein they dwelt. Outside, men lived under the tyranny of things. Their every action was determined by the orders of mere matter, by money, and the tools of their trade, and the unthinking laws of habit and convention. But here, I seemed to be safe from things, living at a remove from actuality. Here, where a bearded old man, improbable survival from some other time, indomitably played the music of romance despite the fact that the phantasms of horror might occasionally drown the sound of it with their clamor. "So, will you take it?" The voice of the old man broke across my thoughts. "I will let you have it for 5 shillings. He was holding out the thick, dilapidated volume towards me. His face wore a look of strained anxiety. I could see how eager he was to get my 5 shillings, how necessary, poor man, for him. He has been, I thought, with an unreasonable bitterness, he has been simply performing for my benefit, like a trained dog. His aloofness, his culture, all a business trick. I felt aggrieved. He was just one of the common phantasms of horror masquerading as the angel of this somewhat comic paradise of contemplation. I gave him a couple of half-crowns and he began wrapping the book in paper. "I tell you," he said, "I'm sorry to part with it. I get attached to my books, you know. But they always have to go." He sighed with such an obvious genuineness of feeling that I repented of the judgment I had passed upon him. He was a reluctant inhabitant of the infernal realms, even as was I myself. Outside, they were beginning to cry the evening papers. A ship sunk, trenches captured. Somebody's new, stirring speech. We looked at one another, the old bookseller and I, in silence. We understood one another without speech. Here we were, in particular, and here was the whole of humanity in general, all faced by the hideous triumph of things. In this continued massacre of men, in this old man's enforced sacrifice, matter equally triumphed. And walking homeward through Regent's Park, I, too, found matter triumphing over me. My book was unconscionably heavy, and I wondered what in the world I should do with a piano score of Robert the Devil when I had got it home. It would only be another thing to weigh me down and hinder me, and at the moment it was very, abominably heavy. I leaned over the railings that ring round the ornamental water, and as unostentatiously as I could, I let the book fall into the bushes. I often think it would be best not to attempt the solution of the problem of life. Living is hard enough without complicating the process by thinking about it. The wisest thing, perhaps, is to take for granted the wearisome condition of humanity born under one law to another bound, and to leave the matter at that, without an attempt to reconcile the incompatibles. The absurd difficulty of it all. And I have, moreover, wasted 5 shillings, which is serious, you know, in these thin times. Let us now move on to the final short story in our Aldous Huxley collection tonight. And I've saved the longest for last. Published in 1923 in Strand Magazine, Volume 65, with 4,331 words. A Deal in Old Masters. "Pictures," said Mr. Bigger. "You want to see some pictures? Wow, we have a very interesting mixed exhibition of modern stuff in our galleries at the moment. French and English, you know." The customer held up his hand, shook his head. No, nothing modern for me," he declared in his pleasant northern English. "I want real pictures, old pictures. Rembrandt and Sir Joshua Reynolds and that sort of thing." "Perfectly," Mr. Bigger nodded. Old masters? Oh, of course, we deal in the old as well as the modern. The fact is, said the other, that I've just bought a rather large house. A manor house, he added in impressive tones. Mr. Bigger smiled. There was an ingenuousness about this simple-minded fellow which was most engaging. He wondered how the man had made his money. A manor house. The way he had said it was really charming. He was a man who had worked his way up from serfdom to the lordship of a manor, from the broad base of the feudal pyramid to the narrow summit. His own history and all the history of classes had been implicit in that awed, proud emphasis on the manor. But the stranger was running on. Mr. Bigger could not allow his thoughts to wander further. In a house of this style, he was saying, and with a position like mine to keep up, one must have a few pictures. Old masters, you know. Rembrandts and what's his names. Of course, said Mr. Bigger. An old master is a symbol of social superiority. That's just it, cried the other, beaming. You've said just what I wanted to say. Mr. Bigger bowed and smiled. It was delightful to find someone who took one's little ironies as sober seriousness. Of course, we should need old masters only downstairs in the reception room. It would be too much of a good thing to have them in the bedrooms too. Altogether too much of a good thing, Mr. Bigger assented. As a matter of fact, the lord of the manor went on, my daughter, she does a bit of sketching, and very pretty it is. I'm having some of her things framed to hang in the bedrooms. It's useful having an artist in the family. Saves you buying pictures. But of course we must have something old downstairs. I think I have exactly what you want. Mr. Bigger got up and rang the bell. My daughter does a little sketching. He pictured a large, blonde, barmaid-ish personage, 31 and not yet married, running a bit to seed. His secretary appeared at the door. Bring me the Venetian portrait, Miss Pratt, the one in the back room. You know which I mean. Miss Pratt nodded and disappeared. You're very snug in here, said the lord of the manor, looking round the room. Mr. Bigger's sanctum was austerely luxurious. Business good, I hope? He genuinely did hope it. He liked this fellow. He was sympathetic. He understood things almost before you had begun to explain. He seemed to have known you for years. Mr. Bigger sighed. The slump, he said. We art dealers feel it worse than anyone. Ah, the slump. The lord of the manor chuckled. His round, red, shining face shone with mirth. I foresaw it all the time. Some people seemed to think the good times were going to last forever. What fools! I sold out of everything at the crest of the wave. That's why I can buy pictures now. Mr. Bigger laughed too. This was the right sort of customer. Wish I'd had anything to sell out during the boom, he said. The lord of the manor laughed till the tears rolled down his cheeks. He was still laughing when Miss Pratt re-entered the room. She carried a picture, shield-wise, in her two hands before her. Put it on the easel, Miss Pratt, said Mr. Bigger. Now, he turned to the lord of the manor. What do you think of that? The picture that stood on the easel before them was a half-length portrait, plump-faced, white-skinned, high-bosomed in her deeply scalloped dress of blue silk. The subject of the picture seemed a typical Italian lady of the middle 18th century. A little complacent smile curved the pouting lips, and in one hand she held a black mask, as though she had just taken it off after a day of carnival. Very nice, said the lord of the manor, but he added doubtfully, It isn't very like Rembrandt, is it? It's all so clear and bright. Generally, in old masters you can never see anything at all. They're so dark and foggy." "Very true," said Mr. Bigger. "But not all old masters are like Rembrandt." "I suppose not." The lord of the manor seemed hardly convinced. "This is 18th century Venetian. Their color was always luminous. Giangiolini was the painter. He died young, you know. Not more than half a dozen of his pictures are known. And this is one." The lord of the manor nodded. He could appreciate the value of rarity. "One notices at a first glance the influence of Longhi," Mr. Bigger went on airily, "and there is something of the morbidezza of Rosalba in the painting of the face." The lord of the manor was looking uncomfortably from Mr. Bigger to the picture, and from the picture to Mr. Bigger. There is nothing so embarrassing as to be talked at by someone processing more knowledge than you do. Mr. Bigger pressed his advantage. "Curious," he went on, "that one sees nothing of Tiepolo's manner in this. Don't you think so?" The lord of the manor nodded. His face wore a gloomy expression. The corners of his baby's mouth drooped. One almost expected him to burst into tears. "It's pleasant," said Mr. Bigger, relenting at last, "to talk to somebody who really knows about painting. So few people do." "Well, I can't say I've ever gone into the subject very deeply," said the lord of the manor modestly. "But I know what I like when I see it." His face brightened again as he felt himself on safer ground. "A natural instinct," said Mr. Bigger. "That's a very precious gift. I could see by your face that you had it. I could see that the moment you came into the gallery." The lord of the manor was delighted. "Really now?" he said. He felt himself growing larger, more important. "Really?" He cocked his head critically on one side. "Yes, I must say, I think that's a very fine bit of painting. Very fine, but the fact is I should rather have liked a more historical piece, if you know what I mean. Something more ancestor-like, you know. A portrait of somebody with a story, like Anne Boleyn or Nell Gwyn or the Duke of Wellington or someone like that." "But my dear sir, I was just going to tell you this picture has a story." Mr. Bigger leaned forward and tapped the lord of the manor on the knee. His eyes twinkled with benevolent and amused brightness under his bushy eyebrows. There was a knowing kindliness in his smile. "A most remarkable story is connected with the painting of that picture." "You don't say so." The lord of the manor raised his eyebrows. Mr. Bigger leaned back in his chair. "The lady you see there," he said, indicating the portrait with a wave of the hand, "was the wife of the 4th Earl Hurtmore. The family is now extinct. The 9th Earl died only last year. I got this picture when the house was sold up. It's sad to see the passing of these old ancestral homes." Mr. Bigger sighed. The lord of the manor looked solemn, as though he were in church. There was a moment's silence, then Mr. Bigger went on in a changed tone. "From his portraits, which I have seen, the 4th Earl seems to have been a long-faced, gloomy, grey-looking fellow. One can never imagine him young. He was the sort of man who looks permanently 50. His chief interests in life were music and Roman antiquities. There's one portrait of him holding an ivory flute in one hand and resting the other on a fragment of Roman carving. He spent at least half his life traveling in Italy looking for antiques and listening to music. When he was about 55, he suddenly decided that it was about time to get married. This was the lady of his choice. Mr. Bigger pointed to the picture. His money and his title must have made up for many deficiencies. One can't imagine from her appearance that Lady Hurtmore took a great deal of interest in Roman antiquities, nor, I should think, did she care much for the science and history of music. She liked clothes, she liked society, she liked gambling, she liked flirting, she liked enjoying herself. It doesn't seem that the newly wedded couple got on too well, but still, they avoided an open breach. A year after the marriage, Lord Hurtmore decided to pay another visit to Italy. They reached Venice in the early autumn. For Lord Hurtmore, Venice meant unlimited music. It meant Galuppi's daily concerts at the orphanage of the Misericordia. It meant Piccini at Santa Maria. It meant new operas at the San Mois. It meant delicious cantatas at 100 churches. It meant private concerts of amateurs. It meant Porpora and the finest singers in Europe. It meant Tartini and the greatest violinists. For Lady Hurtmore, Venice meant something rather different. It meant gambling at the Ridotto, masked balls, gay supper parties, all the delights of the most amusing city in the world. Living their separate lives, both might have been happy here in Venice, almost indefinitely. But one day, Lord Hurtmore had the disastrous idea of having his wife's portrait painted. Young Giangiolini was recommended to him as the promising, the coming painter. Lady Hurtmore began her sittings. Giangiolini was handsome and dashing. Giangiolini was young. He had an amorous technique as perfect as his artistic technique. Lady Hurtmore would have been more than human if she had been able to resist him. She was not more than human. None of us are, eh? The lord of the manor dug his finger into Mr. Bigger's ribs and laughed. Politely, Mr. Bigger joined in his mirth. When it had subsided, he went on. In the end, they decided to run away together across the border. They would live at Vienna, live on the Hurtmore family jewels, which the lady would be careful to pack in her suitcase. They were worth upward of 20,000, the Hurtmore jewels, and in Vienna, under Maria Theresa, one could live handsomely on the interest of 20,000. The arrangements were easily made. Giangiolini had a friend who did everything for them, got them passports under an assumed name, hired horses to be in waiting on the mainland, placed his gondola at their disposal. They decided to flee on the day of the last sitting. The day came. Lord Hurtmore, according to his usual custom, brought his wife to Giangiolini's studio in a gondola, left her there, perched on the high-backed model's throne, and went off again to listen to Galuppi's concert at the Misericordia. It was the time of full carnival. Even in broad daylight, people went about in masks. Lady Hurtmore wore one of black silk. You see her holding it there in the portrait. Her husband, though he was no reveller and disapproved of carnival junketings, preferred to conform to the grotesque fashion of his neighbors rather than attract attention to himself by not conforming. The long black cloak, the huge three-cornered black hat, the long-nosed mask of white paper were the ordinary attire of every Venetian gentleman in these carnival weeks. Lord Hurtmore did not care to be conspicuous. He wore the same. There must have been something richly absurd and incongruous in the spectacle of this grave and solemn-faced English milord, dressed in the clown's uniform of a gay Venetian masker. Pantalon in the clothes of Pulcinella, was how the lovers described him to each other. The old dotard of the eternal comedy dressed up as the clown. Well, this morning, as I have said, Lord Hurtmore came as usual in his hired gondola, bringing his lady with him, and she in turn was bringing under the folds of her capacious cloak a little leather box, wherein, snug on their silken bed, reposed the Hurtmore jewels. Seated in the dark little cabin of the gondola, they watched the churches, the richly fretted palazzi, the high, mean houses gliding past them. From under his Punch's mask, Lord Hurtmore's voice speaks gravely, slowly, imperturbably. "The learned Father Martini," he said, "has promised to do me the honor of coming to dine with us tomorrow. I doubt if any man knows more of musical history than he. I will ask you to be at pains to do him special honor." "You may be sure I will, my lord." She could hardly contain the laughing excitement that bubbled up within her. Tomorrow at dinner time she would be far away, over the frontier, beyond Gorizia, galloping along the Vienna road. Poor old Pantaloon. But no, she wasn't in the least sorry for him. After all, he had his music, he had his odds and ends of broken marble. Under her cloak, she clutched the jewel case more tightly. How intoxicatingly amusing her secret was. Mr. Bigger clasped his hands and pressed them dramatically over his heart. He was enjoying himself. He turned his long, foxy nose toward the Lord of the Manor and smiled benevolently. The Lord of the Manor, for his part, was all attention. "Well?" he inquired. Mr. Bigger unclasped his hands and let them fall onto his knees. "Well," he said, "the gondola draws up at Giangiolini's door. Lord Hurtmore helps his wife out, leads her up to the painter's great room on the first floor, commits her into his charge with his usual polite formula, then goes off to hear Galuppi's morning concert at the Misericordia. The lovers have a good 2 hours to make their final preparations. Old Pantaloon safely out of sight. Up pops the painter's useful friend, masked and cloaked like everyone else in the streets and on the canals of this Carnival Venice. Follow embracements and handshakings and laughter all round. Everything has been so marvelously successful. Not a suspicion roused. From under Lady Hurtmore's cloak comes the jewel case. She opens it, and there are loud Italian exclamations of astonishment and admiration. The brilliants, the pearls, the great Hurtmore emeralds, the ruby clasps, the diamond earrings, all these bright, glittering things are lovingly examined, knowingly handled. 50,000 sequins at the least is the estimate of the useful friend. The two lovers throw themselves ecstatically into each other's arms. The useful friend interrupts them. There are still a few last things to be done. They must go and sign for their passports at the Ministry of Police. Oh, a mere formality. But still, it has to be done. He will go out at the same time and sell one of the lady's diamonds to provide the necessary funds for the journey. Mr. Bigger paused to light a cigarette. He blew a cloud of smoke and went on. So they set out, all in their masks and capes, the useful friend in one direction, the painter and his mistress in another. Ah, love in Venice. Mr. Bigger turned up his eyes in ecstasy. "Have you ever been to Venice and in love, sir?" he inquired of the Lord of the Manor. "Never farther than Dieppe," said the Lord of the Manor, shaking his head. "Ah, then you've missed one of life's great experiences. You can never fully and completely understand what must have been the sensations of little Lady Hurtmore and the artist as they glided down the long canals, gazing at each other through the eye holes of their masks. Sometimes, perhaps, they kissed, though it would have been difficult to do that without unmasking. And there was always the danger that someone might have recognized their naked faces through the windows of their little cabin. No, on the whole, Mr. Bigger concluded reflectively, I expect they confined themselves to looking at each other. But in Venice, drowsing along the canals, one can almost be satisfied with looking, just looking. He caressed the air with his hand and let his voice drop away into silence. He took 2 or 3 puffs at his cigarette without saying anything. When he went on, his voice was very quiet and even. About half an hour after they had gone, a gondola drew up at Giangelini's door, and a man in a paper mask, wrapped in a black cloak and wearing on his head the inevitable 3-cornered hat, got out and went upstairs to the painter's room. It was empty. The portrait smiled sweetly and a little fatuously from the easel, but no painter stood before it, and the model's throne was untenanted. The long-nosed mask looked about the room with an expressionless curiosity. The wondering glance came to rest at last on the jewel case that stood where the lovers had carelessly left it, open on the table. Deep set and darkly shadowed behind the grotesque mask, the eyes dwelt long and fixedly on this object. Long-nosed Pulcinella seemed to be wrapped in meditation. A few minutes later, there was the sound of footsteps on the stairs, of 2 voices laughing together. The masker turned away to look out of the window. Behind him, the door opened noisily, drunk with excitement, with the gay, laughable irresponsibility. The lovers burst in. "Aha, cara amico, back already? What luck with the diamond?" The cloaked figure at the window did not stir. Giangelini rattled gaily on. There had been no trouble whatever about the signatures, no questions asked. He had the passports in his pocket. They could start at once. Lady Hurtmore suddenly began to laugh uncontrollably. She couldn't stop. "What's the matter?" asked Giangelini, laughing too. "I was thinking," she gasped between the paroxysms of her mirth. "I was thinking of old Pantaloon sitting at the Misericordia, solemn as an owl, listening." She almost choked, and the words came out shrill and forced as though she were speaking through tears. "Listening to old Galuppi's boring old cantatas." The man at the window turned around. "Unfortunately, madame," he said, "the learned maestro was indisposed this morning. There was no concert." He took off his mask, and so I took the liberty of returning earlier than usual. The long, grey, unsmiling face of Lord Hurtmore confronted them. The lovers stared at him for a moment speechlessly. Lady Hurtmore put her hand to her heart. It had given a fearful jump, and she felt a horrible sensation in the pit of her stomach. Poor Giangelini had gone as white as his paper mask. Even in these days of cicisbeo, of official gentleman friends, there were cases on record of outraged and jealous husbands resorting to homicide. He was unarmed, but goodness only knew what weapons of destruction were concealed under that enigmatic black cloak. But Lord Hurtmore did nothing brutal or undignified. Gravely and calmly, as he did everything, he walked over to the table, picked up the jewel case, closed it with the greatest care, and saying, "My box, I think," put it in his pocket and walked out of the room. The lovers were left looking questioningly at each other. There was a silence. "What happened then?" asked the lord of the manor. "The anticlimax," Mr. Bigger replied, shaking his head mournfully. "Giangelini had bargained to elope with 50,000 sequins. Lady Hurtmore didn't, on reflection, much relish the idea of love in a cottage. Woman's place, she decided at last, is in the home, with the family jewels. But would Lord Hurtmore see the matter in precisely the same light? That was the question, the alarming, disquieting question. She decided to go and see for herself. She got back just in time for dinner. "His illustrissimus excellency is waiting in the dining room," said the majordomo. The tall doors were flung open before her. She swam in majestically, chin held high, but with what a terror in her soul. Her husband was standing by the fireplace. He advanced to meet her. "I was expecting you, madame," he said, and led her to her place. That was the only reference he ever made to the incident. In the afternoon, he sent a servant to fetch the portrait from the painter's studio. It formed part of their baggage when, a month later, they set out for England. The story has been passed down with the picture from one generation to the next. I had it from an old friend of the family when I bought the portrait last year. Mr. Bigger threw his cigarette end into the grate. He flattered himself that he told that tale very well. "Very interesting," said the lord of the manor. "Very interesting indeed. Quite historical, isn't it? One could hardly do better with Nell Gwyn or Anne Boleyn, could one?" Mr. Bigger smiled vaguely, distantly. He was thinking of Venice, the Russian countess staying in his pension, the tufted tree in the courtyard outside his bedroom, that strong hot scent she used. It made you catch your breath when you first smelt it. And there was the bathing on the Lido, and the gondola, and the dome of the Salute against the hazy sky, looking just as it looked when Guardi painted it. How enormously long ago and far away it all seemed now. He was hardly more than a boy then. It had been his first great adventure. He woke up with a start from his reverie. The lord of the manor was speaking. "How much now would you want for that picture?" he asked. His tone was detached, offhand. He was a rare one for bargaining. "Well," said Mr. Bigger, quitting with reluctance the Russian countess, the paradisal Venice of 25 years ago, "I've asked as much as 1,000 for less important works than this, but I don't mind letting this go for 750. The lord of the manor whistled. 750? He repeated. "It's too much." "But my dear sir," Mr. Bigger protested, "think what you'd have to pay for a Rembrandt of this size and quality. 20,000 at least. 750 isn't at all too much. On the contrary, it's very little, considering the importance of the picture you're getting. You have a good enough judgment to see that this is a very fine work of art." "Oh, I'm not denying that," said the lord of the manor. "All I say is that 750's a lot of money. Whew, I'm glad my daughter does sketching. Think if I'd had to furnish the bedrooms with pictures at 750 a time." He laughed. Mr. Bigger smiled. "You must also remember," he said, "that you're making a very good investment. Late Venetians are going up. If I had any capital to spare..." The door opened and Miss Pratt's blonde and frizzy head popped in. "Mr. Crowley wants to know if he can see you, Mr. Bigger." Mr. Bigger frowned. "Tell him to wait," he said irritably. He coughed and turned back to the lord of the manor. "If I had any capital to spare, I'd put it all into Late Venetians, every penny." He wondered, as he said the words, how often he had told people that he'd put all his capital, if he had any, into primitives, cubism, nigger sculpture, Japanese prints. In the end, the lord of the manor wrote him a check for 680. "You might let me have a typewritten copy of the story," he said as he put on his hat. "It would be a good tale to tell one's guests at dinner, don't you think? I'd like to have the details quite correct." "Oh, of course, said Mr. Bigger. "The details are most important." He ushered the little round man to the door. Good morning. He was gone. A tall, pale youth with side whiskers appeared in the doorway. His eyes were dark and melancholy. His expression, his general experience were romantic and at the same time a little pitiable. It was young Crowley, the painter. "Sorry to have kept you waiting," said Mr. Bigger. What did you want to see me for?" Mr. Crowley looked embarrassed. He hesitated. How he hated having to do this sort of thing. "The fact is," he said at last, "I'm horribly short of money. I wondered if perhaps you wouldn't mind if it would be convenient to you to pay me for that thing I did for you the other day. I'm awfully sorry to bother you like this." "Not at all, my dear fellow." Mr. Bigger felt sorry for this wretched creature who didn't know how to look after himself. Poor young Crowley was as helpless as a baby. "How much did we settle it was to be?" £20, I think it was," said Mr. Crowley timidly. Mr. Bigger took out his pocketbook. "We'll make it 25, he said. "Oh, no, really, I couldn't. Thanks very much." Mr. Crowley blushed like a girl. "I suppose you wouldn't like to have a show of some of my landscapes, would you?" he asked, emboldened by Mr. Bigger's air of benevolence. No, nothing of your own." Mr. Bigger shook his head inexorably. "There's no money in modern stuff, but I'll take any number of these sham old masters of yours." He drummed with his fingers on Lady Herdmore's sleekly painted shoulder. "Try another Venetian," he added. "This one was a great success."